welcome to Woodline Design. Today we're going to make a heavy-duty cutting board, circular with a long handle. It's made out of Osage wood and white oak that I found here in Missouri. But you can make it out of any kind of heavy wood that'll hold up well with washing and cutting. So let's get down to the shop and see how we're going to do it. Now, my shop is in my basement. So we're going to head down to the shop. Don't mind the cat area. Here we are in the basement. And as you can see, it's chock full of cool stuff to work with. All right, I'm going to have to do a little cleanup, but when I get back, we're going to be ready to build the cutting board. This is a plank of Osage wood that I located from a supplier in Bourbon, Missouri. Osage is a hardwood. It's very resilient and highly resistant to rot. It's a very heavy wood, and it'll work well with the white oak that I want to combine with it for our cutting board. The first thing I like to do is to develop a plan for the project I'm going to be working on. You can do this digitally. I like to use SketchUp, but even just a pencil and paper, a ruler, and maybe a protractor to help you flesh out the principal design of your project is going to help you succeed in completing the projects in the way that you imagine it to be. The next thing I'm doing is simply making what we call the gross cuts. These cuts simply approximate the dimensions of our overall piece. So in this case, I took the Osage plank and I cut it down to 18-inch sections. And then I also have a piece of white oak that I'm going to use for the handle. That's about 2 inches wide, and it's going to be maybe 24 inches in length. Now that I have the gross cuts completed, I'm going to take the 18-inch sections of Osage and run them through a table saw to create a width of no more than 3 inches of each section. We do that because we will assemble these and glue them up, and in doing so, we create a stronger piece that is less prone to warping and cupping. Before your pieces are ready for glue up, it is important to use a plane to make your edges of your pieces as smooth as possible. You can use a hand plane, an electric hand plane, or, as I have in my shop, a thickness planer. But whatever you use, you want to make sure that you run the plane over the edges to make them as close and as tight as possible when they're joined. Now that I have all of my pieces cut and trimmed to the desired dimensions that I want for assembly, I'm ready to assemble. Now what I like to do is at the edge of each piece, where I'm going to be joining the edge of another piece, I like to use biscuits. So I'll use my biscuit cutter, lay in a mortise, and then into that I'll insert a biscuit. This helps in the gluing process and adds an added layer of strength. I will add in a mortise and biscuit about every 4 or 5 inches or so along the edge of each piece. Next in the project comes the glue up, which is a favorite time for me. When I glue up my wood pieces, I use liberal amounts of wood glue such as Titebond 3 or Gorilla Wood Glue. Here, I'm going to glue up one half of the full board first, followed by the other half. And these two halves will then be glued to a center white oak strip, which will complete the board in its entirety, as well as the rough handle. Glued sections are firmly clamped in place, and I wipe away any squeeze out of excess glue, and I leave them in the clamps for at least 24 hours. You will also note that before I join the two halves of my cutting board to the center white oak handle stave of wood, I sliced off about a half inch of width on either side of that white oak stave, up to the last 6 inches or so, and then tapered the handle area to where it runs into the cutting board. This gives the board an easy grip and adds to the overall design nicely. Now that the full cutting board assembly is glued up and solid, I need to sand it all smooth. I start with a belt sander at 80 or 100 grit to really take down all the rough spots, dried glue, and proud edges. Then I will switch to an orbital sander or hand sanding at 120 grit up to 150 grit sandpaper to really smooth out my cutting board. Because it's a cutting board and not a furniture piece, you don't need to sand it to a finer grit than 150. Now, for this piece, I decided to add in an inlaid piece of contrasting wood at a 90-degree angle across the cutting board. I would do this at the upper part of the cutting board and the lower part of the cutting board. I considered a dark brown strip of mahogany, but ultimately I decided to stick with white oak, which was cut and trimmed to 3/4 inches wide by a 1/4 inch deep. I used a router to lay in my inlay channel. I spread in some glue and laid in the inlay strip of white oak. This adds to the overall aesthetic and adds to the strength of the board. With all my wood staves trimmed, joined, and glued up, it was time to cut out the circular shape of my cutting board. Using an extended protractor and pencil, I located the center of my piece and set the protractor to about 9 inches to create a circle with an 18-inch diameter. Then I used an electric jigsaw to cut out the circular pattern. After that, I used a simple 1/4 inch radius curved router bit to smooth and round over the edges of my board as well as the handle edges. I did this on both sides of my cutting board. After a final sanding at 150 grit, my Osage and oak cutting board was complete. I drilled a small hole at the end of the handle and looped in a thin leather strip and knotted it off so the board could be hung from a hook. I used a natural paste made from 1 part melted beeswax and 1 part olive oil as a natural sealant to preserve my board. You can also use any number of natural food grade cutting board sealants as well. Never put a cutting board in a dishwasher. Just scrape it off with a knife edge, wash in warm soapy water, rinse, and let it drip dry. And every few years, give it a light sanding and reseal it in wax and oil. If cared for properly, this board will provide you with years of service. Well, I certainly hope that you've enjoyed this woodworking project from the basement shop at Woodline Design here in St. Louis, Missouri. Now look for more videos in the near future, and don't forget, if you like what you see, hit that like button. So, until next time, this is your woodworking Sherpa, Patrick McCarthy, signing off for now, but encouraging you to keep your hands dirty and your head busy with lots of fun projects throughout the year.